last one I'll throw out, and then we'll get into the camps here, into the feasts. The camp of Israel. I'm often say that every detail in the Old Testament is there by design, and that design will always point to Christ. Well, here's a challenge. In Numbers 2, we know that there's a census being taken of the people. If every detail in the Scriptures is there by design, what about this? What could be hidden behind the details that are given us, the camp of Israel? Numbers 2 is just a big census, just a census of the population. Jesus said, the volume of the book is written of me. Let's see if this plays out here. As we go through those 12 tribes, we discover that not only are they enumerated, not the total population, but the population that's over 20 able to go to war. But for every number, you can add a number, maybe 2.5 or something for a wife and a kid or something. You can modify the numbers to get an estimate of the population. But this is the army, actually. But when they camp in 4 camps. Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun are the camp of Judah. Reuben, Simeon, and Gad are the tribe of Reuben, or the camp of Reuben. Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin, those 3 tribes become the camp of Ephraim. And the tribes Asher, and Naphtali would be the camp of Dan. And we have the numbers here. And if you take the numbers of the camps, that'll turn out to be significant for us in a minute. The camp of Judah is the largest, with 186,000. The camp of Ephraim, the smallest, with 108. The other 2 are about 150, give or take. So, okay. There's the Levites' camp in the middle. There's the tabernacle, the Levites, and we're showing this with east to the bottom as the baseline. In the tabernacle, around it, of course, is where the Levites camp. Moses and the priest on the east side of the tabernacle. The Kohathites, Gershonites, and Merarites on the southwest, north sides of the tabernacle, all together being about 22,000. Now, you have to understand this, you have to read the text very carefully. The camp of Judah was to camp east of the Levites, the camp of Reuben to the south of the Levites. If you're going to be strict, there's no way to camp southeast because Judah can be east and Reuben to the south. There isn't any provision for anything but a cardinal element of the compass. Southeast is neither south nor east, so who's going to? Only cardinal directions are ordained, if you will. And whatever the width of the Levites were, we don't know what that was, but that's our unit. That's how wide the camps could be. In other words, length then would be proportional to population. Here's the camp of the Levites. They represent roughly 22,000 in the census. Judah camps, the camp of Judah, those 3 tribes that make up that camp, they can camp as wide as the Levites and then take whatever space they need. Reuben camps to the south. His symbol was the man. These are the ensigns that they're mustered around. And again, they could camp as wide as the Levites and take whatever they need. So this area down here to the southeast doesn't fit either one. So one of the insights here, if you're going to be rabbinical about this, be very precise and give them credit. They worked very hard to try to live to the letter of the law. Southeast was forbidden. Okay, so that goes all the way around. So Ephraim would be to the west, symbol of the ox. And then we have Dan, who originally was a serpent. Ahiezer didn't like that too well, so they replaced it with a serpent in an eagle's mouth, and that later becomes the eagle, if you will. Those are the 4 emblems of the 4 tribes. Okay, so let's stand back. Let's take an aerial view of what's going on here. We have Judah, 186,000. We have Ephraim, the smallest, 108. If you stand back from this, what does the camp of Israel look like? Here you have a sketch, in effect, in Numbers chapter 2, which you could easily mistake. If you were Balaam on top of the hill prophesying over Israel, you'd be looking at a cross. If you were in a space in a time machine helicopter flying over the camp of Israel during its wilderness wanderings, that was apparently what you would be seeing if they follow the text carefully. What's also interesting here is the 4 emblems also are familiar to us as the emblems of the 4 faces of the cherubim surrounding the throne of God. So the camp seems to have modeled itself after the throne of God with the tabernacle in the middle and the man, ox, eagle, and lion representing the 4 gospels, if you will. Lion being Matthew, the lion of the tribe of Judah. The Son of Man being Luke's gospel. The servanthood of an ox being represented by Mark's gospel, and John the eagle. So these are possibilities. Well, let's jump into our particular topics here. One of the things to keep in mind in hermeneutics, your theory of interpretation, is that most of us in the West tend to think of prophecy as prediction plus fulfillment. We see a prediction of some kind, it's fulfilled, we call that prophecy. That's the Western model. The Hebrew mind thinks a little differently. The Hebrew model is that prophecy is pattern. The Jewish scholars paid a lot of attention to the fact that God tends to communicate by patterns, not just the classical prediction plus fulfillment. And that's, we're going to get into some of this. We're going to talk about feasts here. Paul tells us in Colossians chapter 2, he says, "Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of any holy day or of new moon or of Sabbath days." And that indeed is something we should bear in mind. These things are interesting to learn about, but not to be judged by. So many people get fascinated with Shabbat, Sabbath. That's great, but that shouldn't be a point of division or judgment. And we'll come to that later in this discussion. But the other thing that Paul points out to, after having commented on these things, new moons, holy days, so forth, which are a shadow of things to come. See, a feast has a historic or memorial context. Each one of the 7 feasts of Moses that we're going to get into has a historical root or basis. But it's not limited to that. They are a shadow of things to come. Each feast has a historical role and a prophetic role. And it's interesting that each feast is not only prophetic, it ends up getting fulfilled on the day it's observed, interestingly enough, as you'll see as we go here. So that's so we're moving into Leviticus 23, what deals with the appointed times. It was Rabbi Hirsch that said many years ago, a Jew's catechism is his calendar. So many of us that have a denominational background may be familiar with catechisms, what we really believe in studying that. Well, the Jew's catechism turns out to be his calendar in many real ways. And they have a heptadic calendar. Their calendar is built on a multiple of 7s. Heptadic simply means sevenfold. Obviously, there's a week of days. We all deal with that. The 7th day of the week, of course, is Shabbat. Not Sunday. Sunday's the first day of the week. Shabbat is the 7th day of the week. Secular calendars are trying to get away from that, but that's contrary to God. God's 7th day is clearly a Shabbat. So in the Jewish mind, you have a week of days. You also have a week of weeks. We're going to run into one of those in this, where you have a week of weeks, 7 weeks of 7 days each. You also have a week of months. The religious year will be built on a week of months. In fact, there's 2 of them. There's 2 weeks of 7 months each that we'll talk about. There's a week of years. They call that the sabbatical year. 6 years you plow your land and raise crops, but the 7th year you had to give the land a year of rest. And that was the sabbatical year. The land was entitled to a rest also. And when you take 7 weeks plus 1, you get the Jubilee year. Very interesting concept in the Scripture, very understudied. In the Jubilee year, all land reverts to its owners, all slaves go free, all debts are forgiven. In Peter's second sermon in Acts chapter 3, he makes reference to the second coming of Christ as the time of restitution of all things, a phrase that's used of the Jubilee year. So there's a prophetic implication here that is worth some serious study. Now I want to call your attention to a verse in Genesis chapter 1. And God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years." We're all familiar with it, Genesis 1. The word for seasons there, translated as seasons, actually is hamoyadim, which means the appointed times. This is an interesting word for a number of reasons. There are, as every Jew would point out to you, there are 70 appointed times. Let's understand this. There are, of course, 52 Sabbaths each year, each Shabbat of a calendar. There are 7 days that we call Passover, but that includes its related feast days. We'll collectively call them Passover, and we'll get into that in a minute. Then there's several one-day feasts: Shavuot, Feast of Weeks; Yom Teruah, the Feast of